study design and also an introduction to critical appraisal. When we talk about study design, we often pair it with a discussion of the levels of evidence. And we'll be discussing what each of those means in the study designs. But to start with, we look at the levels of evidence, and they go from level 1 through 5. Level 1, at the highest level of evidence, are the systematic reviews, meta-analyses, and randomized control trials. Level 2 are the two-group non-randomized studies, such as cohort and case control, or just basically non-randomized control trials. Level 3 are the one-group non-randomized studies, such as before and after studies, and pretest and post-test studies. Level 4 are those descriptive studies that include an analysis of outcomes, such as single subject designs and case series. And level 5 are case reports and expert opinions that may include narrative literature reviews and non-evidence-based consensus statements. Just a note that qualitative studies are reviewed separately, so will not be included in this discussion. Qualitative studies are, of course, extremely valuable, but just are not included in the quantitative levels of evidence. There is also a hierarchy of evidence, so that the studies that are at the higher level of evidence, higher design level of evidence, are least vulnerable to bias that can occur based on the study design. And we'll talk about that in a minute. They're more generalizable, so that you can generalize from that study to that study population to perhaps other study populations. And the outcomes that you see from the study are more likely to be attributed to the intervention being studied. So let's start at the highest level of evidence, and let's look at the randomized control trial. Now, for each of these study designs, what I've done is to do screenshots of recent AJOT articles that were published, and to show the abstracts. And for a variety of reasons. One, because I think it's really interesting to see that in a journal there can be very different levels of evidence, often based on where the research is in a given topic, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about the level 5 evidence. But I think it's also interesting because it gives you the opportunity to see where you find clues for the study design. For this one, it's very easy to see where the study design is located. If you read the title, Effects of Stability Balls on Children's On-Task Behavior, Academic Achievement, and Discipline Referrals, a Randomized Control Trial, you see it right in the title. Sometimes you'll see it in the abstract, and sometimes you have to hunt for it a little bit in the method section of an article. But studies these days, whereas in the past they didn't always have the study design, these days the study design is found somewhere in the article. And as an aside, not often, in some instances, mostly it's pretty clear what the study design is, and then you can assign it to a level of evidence. In some cases, in the study design, it's a little unclear what the authors mean, and it can be a bit of a challenge to assign a level of evidence, but you persevere and you can find that level of evidence. So in the randomized control trials, what we have is that there are at least two groups, one group with an experimental intervention, and a second group either with no intervention or with standard care of intervention. So experimental intervention is really to look at something better, faster, or just different from the usual intervention that is studied. And the special sauce for the randomized control trial is that the participants are assigned to either the intervention or control group based on random assignment, so that either there is a coin toss or a random number generator, and there are other ways to randomly generate assignment, but that is done in this situation, in this type of study design, that's done to make sure that assignment is done randomly. In cases where it's not done randomly, there is always a little bit of a question of how participants were assigned to one group, and that can potentially affect the results a little bit. So this is the randomized control trial. Another type of level 1 study are the systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And these are systematically focused questions that have a systematic review of the evidence. So they go back a long time period to find evidence, have specific search terms to find the evidence, and go to multiple databases to find the evidence. So the evidence is really combed to find articles that will fit the criteria of a focused question. In this case, the study, Occupational Therapy Interventions to Improve Driving Performance in Older Adults, a Systematic Review, by Kathleen Golitz. Again, this is the study design is right in the title. The information on OT interventions for older adults and their driving performance was reviewed systematically. This study was an update of an earlier study, an earlier systematic review done by the AOTA Evidence-Based Practice Project, and the earlier study was published in 2008. This study was also part of one of the systematic review series that AOTA's EBP project conducts. And just to discriminate between systematic reviews and meta-analyses. Meta-analyses have a quantitative summary number, or they look at it quantitatively of the results of the evidence. In cases where there are maybe multiple themes of evidence, and it would be hard to sort of combine the evidence and the results of the evidence quantitatively, a systematic review is done. But again, systematic reviews and meta-analyses are both high levels of evidence. Level 2 studies are the non-randomized control trials. And in that situation, there are 2 study groups, but assignment is done non-randomly, often done based on the first group that comes to a center for the study. They are assigned to, may be assigned to the experimental intervention, and those coming later or put on the wait list are the second group. Not saying this is a very good level of evidence, but because it lacks the randomization that's seen in level 1 studies, it does sort of drop it down a notch, but they still are very good studies. An example of this type of study, again, a recent study published in AJAT, Efficacy of a Crisis Intervention in Improving Mother-Child Interaction and Children's Play Functioning. And if you look down in the method section, you'll see using a pre-test, post-test, 2-group control study design. And that's why it could be labeled a level 2 evidence non-randomized control trial. Level 3 study. This is where we get a little bit lower level of evidence. It's 1 group, pre-test, post-test. The group would be evaluated on a pre-test, post-test basis. Often this is done if you have a larger group that you are wanting to evaluate for a pilot study to see how things go, and then to do a randomized control trial or a non-randomized control trial. But in the case of results of a school-based evidence-based practice initiative, they wanted to test out their program to see how things what the results would be, and were willing to sort of go with a level 3 study and felt that it was adequate enough, and obviously the publishers felt that it was an adequate study design for the type of study that you'll see, again, published recently in AJAT. Level 4 studies are the case series and single subject design. Those are usually smaller studies in which the group is studied on an intense basis, but because of the size and the type of design, it's a little bit lower evidence. But again, done for a pilot study. In this case, mental practice triggered electrical stimulation in chronic, moderate, upper extremity hemiparesis after stroke. A small case series was done. For this, you'll see that there are 5 participants, small study. To find this study design, you do need to look in the methods section of the article. And the last level that I mentioned were the level 5 studies, and those are case reports and narrative literature review. Again, as I mentioned, the preliminary evidence, often a case report, could be important. And in this case, you'll see that the title says that it is a case report using mirror therapy in the home environment, a case report. And this was done to test out a therapy that is done in other environments, but to test it out in the home. And using a case report, a small sample, gives you rich information that you're looking for in order to then, that you need, looking for and then you also need in order to develop a larger study. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about critical appraisal. And this is the process that we go about. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to be focusing on single studies for this section of the course, and because we want you as a group to get experience evaluating single articles rather than jumping into looking at systematic reviews. Those are really valuable. We are involved with them on a regular basis, but for the purpose of the educational purpose and for the purpose of sort of getting your feet wet, it's a really good idea to look at the individual studies. So critical appraisal is the process of carefully and systematically examining research to judge its trustworthiness and its value and relevance in a particular context. Full critical appraisal also includes the value and relevance of the scope of occupational therapy practice. And that part we'll be looking at later on in the semester. For this part of the semester, we'll be looking at more of the design, the things that go into the study, the methods of the study, the results and the conclusions, rather than what it means for occupational therapy practice. So, what do you want to know about in critical appraisal? When you're looking at a study, besides the design, you want to look at whom the study is about. What's the population? Who was included in the study? Who was excluded? How were your participants recruited? And did the study ask a clearly focused question? And when you say focused question, we're talking about the research objectives of the study. What did the researchers want to look at? Another part of critical appraisal is what was the intervention? Does the study include a description of the intervention? And this may seem like a very matter-of-fact type of thing, but in older studies, Often there was not a description of this intervention. It was really hard to know. They might have mentioned the title, or they might have mentioned briefly what it was about, but there was not a real in-depth description of the intervention. And that's something that you want to know what the researchers did. Do you know how long the intervention took place? And if there was a comparison group, was that intervention or lack of intervention described? You want to know in critical appraisal, how was the outcome measured? Is the outcome that was used appropriate for the question? And as we discussed in past sessions, was the outcome reliable? Was it valid? And was the assessment blind? We'll be talking about that a little bit more in the next session. But did the assessors know to which group people were assigned? And that's a very important thing to know, because just like we discussed, was the assignment blind or randomized? Was it randomized? Did people doing the outcome assessment know to which group people had been assigned? You want to know, was the study large enough and of adequate duration to make the results credible? So in critical appraisal, you look at the sample size, you look at the follow-up, and you look at the length of the study and the completeness and how they evaluated dropouts. And dropouts are people that leave a study. And the last part of critical appraisal, and this is just again for the introduction, for this week's introduction, was the statistical analysis appropriate? Were the conclusions justified? So that you want to know that for those first two bullets, did the researchers use appropriate statistical procedures, or was there something else that they could have used? And based on the results, were the conclusions justified? Often, you'll see an abstract that presents results of the study. When you go, I shouldn't say often, sometimes, and rather infrequently, you will see that there's somewhat of a discrepancy between the results presented in an abstract and the results presented in the study. So you want to compare that the results in both were appropriate, and then also to then make the leap to the conclusions. Could the researchers really make the leap with those results, study results? Was there a conflict of interest? While we often see that type of conflict of interest problem in pharmaceutical studies, where a pharmaceutical company may sponsor a study, in some of occupational therapy studies where there may be equipment involved and a company sponsors those, you want to know that there was a conflict, could potentially be a conflict of interest. Not all industry-sponsored studies have to be bad, but you want to know at least that there was a conflict of, there could be a conflict of interest, and that it was appropriately mentioned. And then lastly, as we mentioned at the beginning, is there what is the level of evidence and the type of study design? So these are the beginning parts of critical appraisal that you want to think about. And in the next session, we'll be going more in depth into those and to look at how we use how we use things. We can go through an article and use templates to make critical appraisal easier. So have a good week and look forward to seeing you next week.